Before joining Ozzy, Jake E. Lee had very short stints with Rat, Motley Crue, Rough Cut, and Ronnie James Dio. He actually joined Rough Cut because their manager was Wendy Dio, and that's how he got in Dio. They started rehearsals in Los Angeles in the summer of 1982. Ronnie sang and played bass, Vinny Appice on drums, and Jake E. Lee on guitar. However, Jake did not gel with Ronnie, and after 6 months of rehearsals, he was dismissed. According to Jake, Ronnie wanted a more straightforward, British-sounding guitar player. He wanted Jake to play simple block chords that wouldn't trample on his vocals. After the dismissal, Jake was devastated. He tried to numb the pain with booze. In late 1982, Ozzy was looking for a guitar player while still touring with Brad Gillis on guitar. And Ozzy got George Lynch in the band. George played sound checks. George had a wife and 2 kids at that point. He was delivering booze to the bad areas and neighborhoods nobody wanted to go to. That was his job. And he had to drop that job because he wanted to play guitar in Ozzy's band. He really needed that gig because he had to support his family. He spent 2 months with Ozzy playing sound checks, but eventually when Ozzy's tour reached Los Angeles, Ozzy invited Jake E. Lee for an audition. George had short hair at the time for his job, going to those bad neighborhoods, and apparently Ozzy and Sharon decided that his look didn't fit the band, so they decided to go with Jake E. Lee. Ozzy offered the gig to Jake right in front of George Lynch. Ozzy just said to George, "Hey, it's not going to be working out. Thanks. See you later. Bye." Sounds like the Osbournes. And George felt devastated. They didn't pay him. They didn't give him any compensation. They didn't ask him if he was okay. They just didn't care. George couldn't believe it. It was so devastating for him that he cried on the way home. According to Lee, Ozzy simply turned to Lynch and said flatly, "It's gone. You've lost it." Pointing to Lee, he announced, "He's the new guitar player." And with that, he walked away. "I did feel bad," Lee admits, "but not as bad as I felt good. And at least I had an early experience of how Ozzy fires people." When Jake E. Lee joined Ozzy, he was young, 25 years old. He was full of life and wanted to play guitar. Jake trusted people and had no idea about how the music business works. From the beginning, Jake E. Lee was told that he would get his fair share of writing credits and publishing, and he took them at their word. Jake said, "I'm pretty sure I got about $100 a week when I joined the band, but it would incrementally go up because they weren't sure about me. Then it doubled, and it would keep doubling on and so on until I proved myself, and I didn't care. I went from having no money and no band to being an Ozzy." Indeed, with Ozzy, Jake lived a rock star lifestyle. They played huge arenas and lived in 5-star hotels. Jake saw Europe and the UK. With Ozzy, he spent the best 5 years of his life. Jake got $500 a week in Ozzy, and apparently he was saving up his money because everything on the road was free and paid by the management. Jake E. Lee actually wrote most of the music for the 1983 album Bark at the Moon, with some help of Bob Daisley, and this record is the only Ozzy Osbourne album on which the songwriting is credited entirely to Ozzy Osbourne. Guitarist Craig Goldie, who was in Dio after Vivian Campbell, explained in an interview with Full in Bloom how bands share songwriting credits, how it works in the music business. According to Craig, it's melody first and then it's lyrics second. It's 50% of the songwriting credit, and the melody is the main thing in songwriting. If singer came up with melody and he's the focal point of the band, he automatically gets 50%. And there's 50% left over between other guys who wrote music, riffs, chord progressions, etc. And according to Jake E. Lee, Ozzy was really good at melodies. Ozzy would pop in the studio towards the end of the night, and he was amazing at how fast he would come up with a melody. He didn't have to work on it and never worked on it. He heard the music, he grabbed the mic, and he made a melody and catchphrase on what the band could build on. So, from the beginning, Sharon promised Jake the songwriting credit and publishing for Bark at the Moon, but in the end, she deceived him. So, this is how it happened. Jake and the band were recording the album at Ridge Farm in the middle of Scotland. Ridge Farm was actually a farm. The recording studio was in the barn. So Jake was by himself. He didn't have management, he didn't have a lawyer or anything. But he was promised, "You'll get what's coming." And Jake kept asking. And finally, once he laid down the final track, Sharon said, "Ah, we have the contract for you." And in the contract it says, Ozzy Osbourne wrote all the songs. You had nothing to do with any of the writing, you have no claim to publishing, and you cannot say so publicly. Jake looked at it, and then he looked at Sharon and said, "This is not what you told me before." And she said, "No, it isn't." And Jake asked, "Well, why do you think I'm going to sign it?" And Sharon replied, "Because if you don't, we'll give you a plane ticket, you go back home, and you stand in line and sue us. In the meantime, we have all your tracks. We'll get another guitar player, he'll redo your tracks, and you'll have nothing." So Jake had no choice but to sign the contract and gave up the songwriting credit. According to Jake, he was going to get $5,000 to record Bark at the Moon and get writing credit and publishing. But when he finally got the contract, they threw in another $10,000 to make up for not having writing and publishing. And here's what Jake says. My portion would have been $250,000 just for the title track, not having publishing on it, which means there was about $250,000 that Ozzy got instead of me. That's a lot of money, but I'm not bitter about it. So he went on the Bark at the Moon tour, but before recording the next record, The Ultimate Sin, this time he made sure he had a contract guaranteeing his writing credit and publishing rights. Jake says, I refused to do anything until I had a contract in front of me promising me writing credit and publishing. The Ultimate Sin was actually awarded platinum status in May 1986 and was awarded double platinum status in October 1994. Lee and Osbourne once again toured extensively, this time with Phil Soussan on bass, John Sinclair on keyboards, and Randy Castillo on drums. So, evidently, as Jake began to claim his rights, he became difficult for Sharon and Ozzy, and they gave him the boot. Sounds like the Osbournes. After Jake lost his job with Ozzy, he didn't work for a year. He said he had a decent amount of money from working in Ozzy. Then the money started running out, and Jakey Lee launched his own project, Badlands. Unfortunately, the singer Ray Gillen got ill, and the band was dropped by their record company in Atlantic. Jake's wife, who was a drug addict, overdosed and died. Then, Ray died of AIDS in 1993, and years later, his parents passed away. And after grunge happened, Jake felt himself unwanted, and he decided to bow out. When Jake was in his 20s, he'd hang out with the guys from Motley Crue and Rat at the Rainbow Bar and Grill in Hollywood, and they'd see local guys, musicians in their 30s who didn't make it, but they were still hanging around trying to do it. And Jake and his buddies would snigger at them, "If you haven't done it by now, you're never going to do it." That's why, after Ozzy and Badlands, Jake gave up on trying to come back. He fell into a careless, lazy lifestyle. There is no pressing need to work. Jake says he had a modest income from royalties, principally The Ultimate Sin. He doesn't own a house. He rented a one-room apartment, and then he lived with friends. Sometimes he sells some of his guitars and gear to pay for the rent or other expenses. Jake has a daughter and a granddaughter whom he adores. Perhaps he sells equipment to generate some revenue for them. On Eddie Trunk's show in December 2013, Jakey Lee confessed, "I don't make enough on my royalty checks to actually support myself. I do get ASCAP, American Society of Composers, Authors, and Publishers, checks from the Ultimate Sin record because my name on there. However, I don't get any money from publishing. Since I don't have any publishing, I don't know how much money I may be missing out on. I've been told that publishing is where the real money is. I basically get songwriters' checks for the Ultimate Sin and all the Badlands material. And apparently, those Ozzy Jake era albums sell peanuts, so he's probably not missing out on much. Shot in the Dark is the only real hit from that era, and it was written by Phil Soussan. So, with no Ozzy income and little to no income from the Badlands and other records, Jake is probably lucky to pay his bills. You have to sell a lot of records to even see a dime. When I hung out with Joe Holmes, who played guitar for Ozzy for a short while, said the same stuff. As soon as he insisted on getting what was due to him, Sharon fired him. Joe had a collection of Marshall amp heads, and I was trying to buy one, and he sternly said no. I did get to see him play, though, Ozzy one time. He was great.